Chapter 17, The Shame of Motley, by Rafael Sabatini, read by Amy of New Zealand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, The Seneschal. For an hour or so that night, I played the fool for Messer Ramiro's entertainment in a manner which did high justice to the fame that at Pesaro I had earned for the name of Boccadoro. Beginning with quip and jest and paradox, aimed now at him, now at the officer who had remained to keep him company in his cups, now at the servants who ministered to him, now at the guards standing at attention, I passed on later to play the part of narrator, and I delighted his foul and prurient mind with the story of Andreuccio da Perugia, and another of the more licentious tales of Messer Giovanni Boccacci. I crimson now with shame at the manner in which I set myself to pander to his mood, that with my wit I might defend my life and limbs, and preserve them for the service of my holy flower of the quince in the hour of her need. One man alone of all those present did I spare my banter. This was the old Seneschal Miriani. He stood at his post by the buffet, and ever and anon he would come forward to replenish Messer Ramiro's cup, in obedience to the monster's imperious orders. What fortitude was it, I wondered, that kept the old man outwardly so calm? His face was as the face of one who is dead, its features set and rigid, its colour ashen. But his step was tolerably firm, and his hand seemed to have lost the trembling that had assailed it under the first shock of the horror he had witnessed. As I watched him furtively, I thought that were I Ramiro, I should beware of him. That frozen calm argued to me some terrible labour of the mind beneath that livid mask. But the governor of Cesena appeared insensible, or else he was contemptuous of danger from that quarter. It may even have delighted his outrageous nature to behold a man whose son he had done to death with such brutality continue obedient and submissive to his will, for it may have flattered his vanity by the concession that bearing seemed to make to his grim power. An hour went by. My second tale was done, and I was now entrancing Messer Ramiro with some impromptu verses upon the divorce of Giovanni Sforza, a theme set me by himself, when I was interrupted by the arrival of a soldier who entered unannounced. I paled and turned cold at the cry with which Ramiro rose to greet him, and the words he dropped, which told me that here was one of the riders of that party that, under Lucagnolo, had been ordered to search the country about Cattolica. Had they found Madonna? Messer Lucagnolo, the fellow announced, has sent me to report to you the failure of his search to the west and north of Cattolica. He has beaten the country thoroughly for 3 leagues of the town on those 2 sides as you desired him, but unfortunately without result. He is now spreading his search to the south, and not a house is being left unvisited. By morning he hopes to report again to your Excellency. A wild wave of joy swept through my soul. They had ransacked the country west and north of Cattolica without result. Why, then, assuredly, they had missed the peasant's hut that sheltered her, and where she waited yet for my return. Their search to the south, I knew, would prove equally futile. I could have fallen on my knees in a prayer of thanksgiving had my surroundings been other than they were. Ramiro's eye wandered round to me and settled on me in a lowering glance. By his face it was plain that the message disappointed him. "I wonder," said he, "whether we could make you talk." And from me his eyes roamed on to the instrument of torture at the end of that long chamber. I grew sick with fear, for if he were to do this thing, and maim me by it, how should I avail myself or her hereafter? "Excellency," I cried, "since you met me, you have hinted at something that I am hiding from you, at something touching which I could give you information did I choose. What it may be passes all thought of mine. But this I do assure you, no torture could make me tell you what I do not know, nor is any torture needed to extract from me such information as I may be possessed of. I do but beg that you will frankly question me upon this matter, whatever it may be, and your Excellency shall be answered to the best of my knowledge." He looked at me as if taken aback a little by my assurance and the seemingly transparent candour of my speech, and in his face I saw that he believed me. A moment he hesitated yet. Then, "I am seeking knowledge concerning Madonna Paola De Santafiore," he said presently, resuming as he spoke his seat at the table. "As I told you, the body which was believed to be dead was stolen in the night from San Domenico. Know you aught of this? It may be an ignoble thing to lie, but with what other weapon was I to fight this brigand? Surely, if an exception can be made to the rule, and a lie become a meritorious thing, such an occasion as this would surely justify such an exception." "I know nothing," I answered boldly, unhesitatingly, and even with a ring of truth and sincerity that was calculated to convince. "Nor can I even believe this rumour. It is a wild story. That the body has been stolen may be true enough. Such things occur. Though he was a bold man who laid hands upon the body of a person of such importance. But that she lives, Jesu, that's an old wives' tale. I had myself the word of the Lord Filippo's physician that she was dead. Nevertheless, this old wives' tale, as you dub it, is one of which I have had confirmation. Lend me your wits, Boccadoro, and you shall not regret it. Exercise them now, and conjecture me who could have abstracted the body from the church. In seeking this information I am acting in the interests of the noble house of Borgia, which I serve, and to which she was to have been allied, as you well know." I could have laughed to see how the apparent sincerity of my denial had convinced him to such an extent that he even sought my help to discover the true thief, and to account for his interest in the matter, he lied to me of his service to the house of Borgia. "I will gladly lend you these wits," said I, "to disprove to you the rumour of which you say that you have confirmation. Let us accept the statement that the body has been stolen. That much, no doubt, is true, for even rumours require some slight foundation. But who in all this world could say that when the body was taken it was not dead? Clearly but one man, he that administered the poison. And, I ask your Excellency, would he be likely to tell the world what he had done?" He might have answered me, "I am that man," but he did not. Instead, he hung his head, as if pondering the words of wisdom I had uttered, words meant to convince him of my own innocence in the matter, and this they achieved at least in part. He flashed me a look of sudden suspicion, it is true, but it faded almost as soon as it shone from his brooding eye. "Maybe I am a fool that I do not string you up and test the truth of what you say," he grumbled. "But I incline to believe you, and you are a merry rogue. You shall remain and have peace and comfort so long as you amuse me. But tremble if I discover that you have sought to deceive me. You shall have the cord first, and other things after, and your death shall be the thing you'll pray for long before it takes you from my vengeance. If you know aught, speak now, and you shall find me merciful. Your life and liberty shall be the recompense of your honesty towards me." "I repeat, Excellency," I answered without changing colour, "that all that I know have I already told you." He was convinced, I think, for the time being. "Get you gone, then," he bade me. "I have other business to deal with ere I sleep. Mariani, see that Boccadoro is well lodged." The old man bowed, and lifting a torch from its socket, he silently motioned me to go with him. I made Messer Ramiro a profound obeisance, and withdrew in the wake of the Seneschal. He led me up a flight of stairs that rose from the hall, and along a gallery that ran half round it. Then plunging down a corridor, he halted presently, and opening a door, ushered me into a tolerably furnished room. A servant followed, carrying the clothes that I had worn when I arrived. The old man lingered a moment after the servant had withdrawn, and his hollow eyes rested on me for a second. I thought that he was on the point of saying something, and I waited, returning his glance with one that quailed before the anguish of his own. I feared to speak, to offer an expression of the sympathy that filled my heart, for in that strange place I could not tell how far a man was to be trusted, even a man so wronged as this one. On his own part, it may be that a like doubt beset him concerning me, for in the end he departed as he had come, no word having passed his ashen lips. Left alone, I surveyed my surroundings by the light of the taper he had left in the iron sconce on the wall. The single window overlooked the courtyard, so that even had I been disposed and able to cut through the iron that barred it, I should but succeed in falling into the hands of the guards who abounded in that nest of infamy. So that, for the night at least, the notion of flight must be abandoned. What the morrow would bring forth we must wait and see. Perhaps some way of escape would offer itself. Then my thoughts returned to Paola, and I was tortured by surmises as to her fate, and chiefly as to how she could have eluded the search that must have been made for her in the hut where I had left her. Had the peasant befriended her, I wondered, and what did she think of my protracted absence? I sat on the edge of the bed and gave rein to my conjectures. The noises in the castle had all ceased, and still I sat on, unconscious of time, my taper burning low. It may have been midnight when I was startled by the sound of a stealthy step in the corridor near my door. A heavy footfall I should have left unheeded, but this soft tread aroused me on the instant, and I sat listening. It halted at my door, and was succeeded by a soft scratching sound. Noiselessly I rose, and with ready hands I waited, prepared, in the instinct of self-preservation, to fall upon the intruder, however futile the act might be. But the door did not open as I expected. Instead, the scratching sound continued, growing slightly louder. Then it occurred to me at last that whoever came might be a friend craving admittance, and proceeding stealthily that others in the castle might not overhear him. Swiftly I crossed to the door and opened. On the threshold a dark figure straightened itself from a stooping posture, and the light of the taper behind me fell on a face of pallor that seemed to glisten in its intensity. It was the face of Mariani, the Seneschal of the castle of Cesena. One glance we exchanged, and intuitively I seemed to apprehend the motive of this midnight visit. He came either to bring me aid, or to seek mine, with vengeance for his guerdon. I stood aside. Silently he entered my room and closed the door. "Quench your taper," he bade me in a husky whisper. Without hesitation I obeyed him, a strange excitement thrilling me. For a second we stood in the dark, then another light gleamed as he plucked away the cloak that masked a lantern which he brought with him. He set the lantern on the floor, and held the cloak in his hand, ready at a moment's notice to conceal the light in its folds. Then pulling me down beside him on the bed where he had perched himself, "My friend," said he, "it may be that I bring you assistance." "Speak, then," I bade him. "You shall not find me slow to act if there is the need or the way." "So I had surmised," he said. "Are you not that same Boccadoro, fool of the court of Pesaro, who donned the Lord Giovanni's armour and rode out to do battle in his stead?" I answered him that I was that man. "I have heard the tale," said he. "Indeed, all Italy has heard it, and knows you for a man of steel, as strong and audacious as you are cunning and resourceful. I know against what desperate odds you fought that day, and how you overcame this terrible Ramiro. This it is that leads me to hope that in the service of your own ends you may become the instrument of my vengeance." "Unfold your project, man," I muttered fiercely, almost in my burning eagerness. "Let me hear what you would have me do." He did not answer me until a sob had shaken his old frame. "That boy," he muttered brokenly, "that golden-haired angel, sent me for the consolation of my decaying years. That lad whom Ramiro destroyed so foully and wantonly was my son. Futile though the attempt had proved, I had certainly set my hands at the tyrant's neck, but that I founded hopes on you of a surer and more terrible revenge. That thought has manned me and upheld me when anguish was near to slaying me outright. To see the boy burn so under my very eyes, God of mercy and pity, that I should have lived so long. Your child burned but a moment, suffered but an instant. For the deed Ramiro will burn in hell through countless generations, through interminable ages." It was a paltry consolation, perhaps, but it was the best that then occurred to me. "Meanwhile," I begged him, "do you tell me what you would have me do?" I urged him to it, that he might thereby suffer his mind to rest a moment from pondering that ghastly thing that he had witnessed, that scene that would live before his eyes until they closed in their last sleep. "You heard Lampagnani quip Ramiro with the fact that 3 messengers have ridden desperately within the week from Città di Castello to Cesena, and you heard, perhaps, his obscure reference to the hat?" "I heard both, and both I weighed," said I. The old man looked at me as if surprised. "And what," he asked, "was the conclusion you arrived at?" "Why, simply this, that whilst the messenger bore some letter from Vitelli to Ramiro, that should serve to lull the suspicions of any who, wondering at so much traffic between these two, should be moved to take a peep into those missives. The true letter, with which the courier rides, is concealed within the lining of his hat, probably unknown even to himself." He stared at me as though I had been a wizard. "Messer Boccadoro," he began. "My name," I corrected him, "is Biancamonte, Lazzaro Biancamonte." "Whatever be your name," he returned, "of the quality of your wits there can be no question. You have guessed for yourself the half of what I was come to tell you. Has your shrewdness borne you any further? Have you concluded aught concerning the nature of those letters?" "I have concluded that it might repay some trouble to discover what is contained in letters that are sent with so much secrecy. I can conceive nothing that might lie between the Lord of Città di Castello and this ruffian of Cesena, and yet treason lurks often where least it is expected, and treason makes stranger bedfellows than misfortune." "Lampugnani was no fool, and yet a great fool," the old man murmured. "He surmised what you have surmised. With each of the messengers Ramiro has dealt in the same manner. He has sent each to be fed and refreshed, whilst waiting to return with the answer he was penning. For their refreshment he has ordered a very full stout wine, not drugged, for that they might discover upon awaking, but a wine that of itself would do the work of setting them to sleep very soundly. Then, when all slept, and only he remained at table, like the drunkard that he is, it has been his habit to descend himself to the kitchen, and possess himself of the messenger's hat. With this he has returned to the hall, opened the lining, and withdrawn a letter. Then, as I suppose, he has penned his answer, thrust it into the lining where the other one had been, and secured it as it was before, with his own hands. He has returned the hat to the place from whence he took it, and when the courier awakens in the morning, there is another letter put into his hand, and he is bidden to bear it to Vitelli. He paused a moment, then continued. Lampugnani must have suspected something and watched Ramiro to make sure that his suspicions were well founded. In that he was wise, but he was a fool to allow Ramiro to see what lie he had discovered. Already he has paid the penalty. He is lying with a dagger in his throat, for an hour ago Ramiro stabbed him while he slept. I shuddered. What a place of blood was this! Could it be that Cesare Borgia had no knowledge of what things were being performed by his governor of Cesena? Poor Lampugnani, I sighed, God rest his soul. I doubt but he is in hell, answered Mariani without emotion. He was as great a villain as his master, and he has gone to answer for his villainy, even as this ugly monster of a Ramiro shall. But let Lampugnani be. I am not come to talk of him. Returning from his bloody act, Ramiro ordered me to bed. I went, and as I passed Lampugnani's room, I saw the door standing wide. It was thus that I learnt what had befallen. I remembered his words concerning the hat, and I remembered old suspicions of my own aroused by the thought of that potent wine which Ramiro had ordered me to see given to the couriers. I sped back to the gallery that overlooks the hall. Ramiro was absent, and I surmised at once that he was gone to the kitchen. Then was it that I thought of you, and of what service you might render if things were indeed as I now more than suspected. Like an inspiration it came to me how I might prepare your way. I ran down to the hall, sweating in my terror that he should return ere I had performed the task I went on. From the buffet I drew a flagon of that same stout wine that Ramiro used upon his messengers. I ripped away the seal and crimson cord by which it is distinguished, and placing it on the table, I removed the flagon I had set for him before I had first departed. Then I fled back to the gallery, and from the shadows I watched for his return. Soon he came, bearing a hat in his hand, and from that hat he took a letter, all as you have surmised. He read it, and I saw his face lighten with a fierce excitement. Then he helped himself freely to wine, and drank thirstily, for all that he was overladen with it. One of the qualities of this wine is that, in quenching thirst, it produces yet a greater. Ramiro drank again, then sat with the letter before him, in the light of the single taper I had left burning. Presently he grew sleepy. He shook himself, and drank again. Then again he sat conning his epistle, and thus I left him, and came hither in quest of you. There followed a pause. Well, I asked at length, what is it you would have me do? Stab him as he sleeps? He shook his head. That were too sweet and sudden a death for him. If it had been no more than a matter of that, my old arms would have lent me strength enough. But think you it would repay me for having seen my boy pinned by that monster's pike to the burning logs? What is it, then, you ask of me? If that letter were indeed the treasonable document we account it, if its treason should be aimed at Cesare Borgia, it could scarce be aimed at another. Would it not be a sweet thing to obtain possession of it? Aye, but when he wakes tomorrow and finds it gone, what then? You know this governor of Cesena well enough to be assured that he would ransack the castle, torture, rack, burn, and flay us all until the missive were forthcoming. That, he groaned, is what deterred me. If I had the means of getting the letter sent to Cesare Borgia, or of escaping with it myself from Cesena, I should not have hesitated. Cesare Borgia is lying at Faenza, and I could ride there in a day, but it would be impossible for me to leave the place before morning. I have duties to perform in the town, and I might get away whilst I am about them, but before then the letter will have been missed, and no one will be allowed to leave the citadel. Why, then, said I, the only hope lies in abstracting that letter in such a manner that he shall not suspect the loss, and that seems a very desperate hope. We sat in silence for some moments, during which I thought intently to little purpose. "Does he sleep yet, think you?" I asked presently. "Assuredly he must. And if I were to go to the gallery, is there any fear that I should be discovered by others?" "None. All at Cesena are asleep by now." "Then," said I, rising, "let us take a look at him. Who knows what may suggest itself? Come." I moved towards the door, and he took up his lantern and followed me, enjoining me to tread lightly. End of chapter 17. May 2025. Chapter 18. The Shame of Motley by Rafael Sabatini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. The Letter. On tiptoe I crept down that corridor to the gallery above the banqueting hall, secure from sight in the enveloping darkness, and intent upon allowing no sound to betray my presence, lest Ramiro should have awakened. Behind me, treading as lightly, came Messer Mariani. Thus we gained the gallery. I leaned against the stout oaken balustrade, and looked down into the black pit of the hall, broken in the centre by the circle of light from the 2 tapers that burnt upon the table. The other torches had all been quenched. At the table sat Messer Ramiro, his head fallen forward and sideways upon his right arm, which was outstretched and limp along the board. Before him lay a paper which I inferred to be the letter whose possession might mean so much. I could hear the old man breathing heavily beside me as I leaned there in the dark, and sought to devise a means by which that paper might be obtained. No doubt it would be the easiest thing in the world to snatch it away without disturbing him, but there was always to be considered that when he waked and missed the letter, we should have to reckon with his measures to regain possession of it. A little while I pondered this, deeming the thing desperate at first. Then an idea came to me on a sudden. Turning to Mariani, I asked him could he find me a sheet of paper of about the size of that letter held by Ramiro. He answered me that he could, and bade me wait there until he should return. I waited, watching the sleeper below, my excitement waxing with every second of the delay. Ramiro was snoring now, a loud, sonorous snore that rang like a trumpet blast through that vast, empty hall. At last Mariani returned, bringing the sheet of paper I had asked for, and he was full of questions of what I intended. But neither the place nor the time was one in which to stand unfolding plans. Every moment wasted increased the uncertainty of the success of my design. Someone might come, or Ramiro might waken despite the potency of the wine he had been given. For, on so well seasoned a toper, the most potent of wines could have but a transient effect. So I left Mariani and moved swiftly and silently to the head of the staircase. I had gone down 2 steps when, in the dark, I missed the third, the bells on my cap jangling at the shock. I brought my teeth together and stood breathless in apprehension, fearing that the noise might awaken him, and cursing myself for a careless fool to have forgotten those infernal bells. Above me I heard a warning hiss from old Mariani, which, if anything, increased my dread. But Ramiro snored on, and I was reassured. A moment I stood debating whether I should go on, or first return to divest myself of that cap of mine. In the end I decided to pursue the latter course. The need for swift and sudden movement might come ere I was done with this adventure, and those bells might easily be the undoing of me. So back I went, to the surprise and infinite dismay of Mariani, until I had whispered in his ear the reason. We retreated together to the corridor, and there, with his help, I removed my jangling headgear, which I left him to restore to my chamber. Whilst he went upon that errand, I returned once more on mine, and this time I gained the foot of the stairs without mishap, and stood in the hall. Ramiro's back was towards me. On my right stood the tall buffet from which the boy had fetched him the wine that evening. This I marked out as the cover, to which I must fly in case of need. A second I stood hesitating, still considering my course. Then I went softly forward, my feet making no sound in the rushes of the floor. I had covered half the distance, and growing bolder, I was advancing more swiftly and with less caution, when suddenly my knee came in contact with a 3-legged stool that had been carelessly left where none would have suspected it. The blow may have hurt afterwards. Indeed, I was conscious of a soreness at the knee, but at the moment I had no thought or care for physical pain. The bench went over with a crash, and for all that the rushes may have deadened in part the sound of its fall, to my nervous ear it boomed like the report of a cannon through the stillness of the place. I turned cold as ice, and the sweat of fear sprang out to moisten me from head to foot. Instantly I dropped on all fours, lest Ramiro, awakening suddenly, should turn, and I waited for the least sign that should render advisable my seeking the cover of the buffet. In the gallery above I could picture old Mariani clenching his teeth at the noise, his knees knocking together, and his face white with horror, for Ramiro's snoring had abruptly ceased. It came to an end with a choking catch of the breath, and I looked to see him raise his head and start up to ascertain what it was that had aroused him. But he never stirred, and for all that he no longer snored, his breathing continued heavy and regular, so that I was cheered by the assurance that I had but disturbed his slumber, not dispelled it. Yet, since I had disturbed and lightened it, a greater precaution was now necessary, and I waited there for some 10 minutes maybe, a period that must have proved a very eternity to the old man upstairs. At last I had the reward of hearing the snoring recommence, lightly at first, but soon with all its former fullness. I rose and proceeded now with a caution that must guard me from any more unlooked-for obstacles. Moreover, as I approached, the darkness was dispelled more and more at every stride in the direction of the light. At last I reached the table, and stood silent as a spectre at Ramiro's side, looking down upon the features of the sleeping man. His face was flushed, and his tawny hair tumbled about his damp brow. His lips quivered as he breathed. For a moment, as I stood gazing on him, there was murder in my mind. His dagger hung temptingly in his girdle. To have drawn it and rid the world of this monster might have been a worthy deed, acceptable in the eyes of heaven. But how should it profit me? Rather must it prove my destruction at the hands of his followers, and to be destroyed just then, with Paola depending upon me, and life full of promise once I regained my liberty, was something I had no mind to risk. My eyes wandered to the letter lying on the table. If this were of the nature we suspected, it should prove a safer tool for his destruction. To read it as it lay was an easy matter, and it came to me then that ere I decided upon my course, it might be well that I should do so. If by chance it were innocent of treason, why, then, I might resort to the risk of that other and more desperate weapon, his own dagger. At the foot of the short flight of steps that led from the hall to the courtyard, I could hear the slow pacing of the sentry placed there by Ramiro. But unless he was summoned, it was extremely unlikely that the fellow would leave his post, so that, I concluded, I had little to fear from that quarter. I drew back, and taking up a position behind Ramiro's chair, a position more favourable to escape in the untoward event of his awaking, I craned forward to read the letter over his shoulder. I thanked God in that hour for two things: that my sight was keen, and that Vitellozzo Vitelli wrote a large, bold hand. Scarcely breathing, and distracted the while by the mad racing of my pulses, I read. And this, as nearly as I can remember, is what the letter contained. Illustrious Ramiro, your answer to my last letter reached me safely. It rejoiced me to learn that you had found a man for our undertaking. See that you have him in readiness, for the hour of action is at hand. Cesare goes south on the 2nd or 3rd day of the new year, and he has announced to me his intention of passing through Cesena on his way, there to investigate certain charges of maladministration which have been preferred against you. These concern, in particular, certain misappropriation of grain and stores, and an excessive severity of rule of which complaints have reached him. From this you will gather that out of a spirit of self-defence, if not to earn the reward which we have bound ourselves to pay you, it is expedient that you should not fail us. The occasion of the Duke's visit to Cesena will be, of all, the most propitious for our purpose. Have your arbalist posed, and may God strengthen his arm and render true his aim, to the end that Italy may be rid of a tyrant. I commend myself to your Excellency, and I shall anxiously await your news. Vitellozzo Vitelli. Here, indeed, were my hopes realized. A plot there was, and it aimed at nothing less than the Duca Valentino's life. Let that letter be borne to Cesare Borgia at Faenza, and I would warrant that within a dozen hours of his receipt of it, he would so dispose that all who had suffered by the cruel tyranny of Ramiro dell'Orca would be avenged, and those who were still suffering would be relieved. In this letter lay my own freedom and the salvation of Madonna Paola, and this letter it behoved me at once to become possessed. It was a safer far alternative than that dagger of his. A moment I stood pondering the matter for the last time. Then stepping sideways and forward, so that I was again beside him, I put out my hand and swiftly whipped the letter from the table. Then standing very still, to prevent the slightest rustle, I remained a second or two observing him. He snored on, undisturbed by my light-fingered action. I drew away a pace or two, as lightly as I might. Folding the letter, I thrust it into my girdle. Then from my open doublet I drew the sheet that Mariani had supplied me, and, advancing again, I placed it on the table in a position almost identical with that which the original had occupied, saving that it was removed a half-finger's breadth from his hand, for I feared to allow it actually to touch him, lest it should arouse him. Holding my breath, for now was I come to the most desperate part of my undertaking, I caught up one of the tapers and set fire to a corner of the sheet. That done, I left the candle laying on its side against the paper, so as to convey the impression to him when presently he awakened that it had fallen from its sconce. Then, without waiting for more, I backed swiftly away, watching the progress of the flames as they devoured the paper and presently reached his hand and scorched it. At that, I dropped again on all fours, and having gained the corner of the buffet, I crouched there, even as, with a sudden scream of pain, he woke and sprang upright, shaking his blistered hand. As a matter of instinct, he looked about to see what it was had hurt him. Then his eyes fell upon the charred paper on the table, and the fallen candle, which was still burning across one end of it. And even to the dull wits of Ramiro del Orca, the only possible conclusion was suggested. He stared at it a moment, then swept that flimsy sheet of ashes from the table with an oath, and sank back once more into his great leathern chair. "Body of God," he swore aloud, "it is well that I had read it a dozen times. Better that it should have been burnt than that someone should have read it whilst I slept." The idea of such a possibility seemed to rouse him to fresh action, for seizing the fallen candle and replacing it in its socket, he rose once more, and holding it high above his head, he looked about the hall. The light it shed may have been feeble, and the shadows about my buffet thick, but, as I have said, my doublet was open, and some ray of that weak candlelight must have found out the white shirt that was showing at my breast. For with a sudden cry he pushed back his chair and took a step towards me, no doubt intent upon investigating that white something that he saw gleaming there. I waited for no more. I had no fancy to be caught in that corner, utterly at his mercy. I stood up suddenly. "Magnificent, it is I announced, with a calm and boundless effrontery. The boldness of it may have staggered him a little, for he paused, although his eyes were glowing horribly with the frenzy that possessed him, the half of which was drunkenness, the other fear and wrath, lest I should have seen his treacherous communication from Vitelli. "What make you here?" he questioned threateningly. "I thirsted, Excellency," I answered glibly. "I thirsted, and I bethought me of this buffet where you keep your wine." He continued to eye me at some 6 paces off, his half-drunken wits no doubt weighing the plausibility of my answer. At last, "If that be all, what cause had you to hide?" he asked me shrewdly. "One of your candles fell over and awakened you," said I. "I feared you might resent my presence, and so I hid." "You came not near the table?" he inquired. "You saw nothing of the paper that I held?" "Nay, by the host, I'll take no risks. You were born neath an unlucky star, fool. For be your reason for your presence here no more than you assert, you have come in a season that must be fatal to you." He set the candle on the table, and carrying his hand to his girdle, he withdrew it sharply, and I caught the gleam of a dagger. In that instant I thought of Mariani waiting above, and like a flash it came to me that if I could outpace this drunken brigand, and gaining the gallery well ahead of him, transfer that letter to the old man's hands, I should not die in vain. Cesare Borgia would avenge me, and Madonna Paola at least would be safe from this villain. If Mariani could reach Valentino at Faenza, I would answer for it that within 24 hours Messer Ramiro del Orca would be the banner on that ghastly beam that he facetiously dubbed his flagstaff, and he would be the blackest, dirtiest banner that ever yet had fluttered there. The thought conceived in the twinkling of an eye, I acted upon without a second hesitation. Ere Ramiro had taken his first step towards me, I had sprung to the stairs, and I was leaping up them with the frantic speed of one upon whose heels death is treading closely. A singular, fierce joy was blent with my measure of fear, a joy at the thought that even now in this extremity I was outwitting him, for never a doubt had he that the burnt paper he had found on the table was all that was left of Vitelli's letter. His fears were that I might have read it, but never a suspicion crossed his mind of such a trick as I had played upon him. So I sped on, the gigantic Ramiro blundering after me, panting and blaspheming, for although powerful, his bulk and the wine he had taken left him no nimbleness. The distance between us widened, and if only Mariani would have had the presence of mind to wait for me at the mouth of the passage, all would be as I could wish it before his dagger found my heart. I was assuring myself of this when in the dark I stumbled, and striking my legs against a stair, I hurtled forward. I recovered almost immediately, but, in my frenzy of haste, to make up for the instant lost, I stumbled a second time, ere I was well upon my feet. With a roar, Ramiro must have hurled himself forward, for I felt my ankle caught in a grip from which there was no escaping, and I was roughly and brutally dragged back and down those stairs, now my head, now my breast beating against the steps as I descended them one by one. But even in that hour the letter was my first thought, and I found a way to thrust it farther under my girdle so that it should not be seen. At last I reached the hall half stunned, and with all the misery of defeat and the certainty of the futility of my death to further torture my last moments. Over me stood Ramiro, his dagger upheld, ready to strike. "Dog," he taunted me, "your sands are run." "Mercy, magnificent," I gasped. "I have done nothing to deserve your poniard." He laughed brutally, delaying his stroke, that he might prolong my agony for his drunken entertainment. "Address your praise to heaven," he mocked me, "and let them concern your soul." Then, like a flash of inspiration, came the words that should delay his hand. "Spare me," I cried, "for I am in mortal sin." Impious, abandoned villain though he was, he said too much when he boasted that he feared neither God nor devil. He was prone to forget his God, and the lessons that as a babe he had learnt at his mother's knee. For I take it that even Ramiro del Orca had once been a babe. But deep down in his soul there had remained the fear of hell, and an almost instinctive obedience to the laws of Mother Church. He could perform such ruthless cruelties as that of hurling a page into the fire to punish his clumsiness. He could rack and stab and hang men with the least shadow of compunction or twinge of conscience. But to slay a man who professed himself to be in mortal sin was a deed too appalling even for this ruthless butcher. He hesitated a second, then he lowered his hand, his face telling me clearly how deeply he grudged me the respite, which yet he dared not do other than accord me. "Where shall I find me a priest?" he grumbled. "Think you the citadel of Cesena is a monastery? I will wait while you make an act of contrition for your sins. It is all the shrift I can afford you, and get it done, for it is time I was abed. You shall have 5 minutes in which to clear your soul." By this it seemed to me, as it may well seem to you, that matters were but little mended, and instead of employing the respite he accorded me in the pious collecting of thoughts which he enjoined, I sat up, very sore from my descent of the stairs, and employed those precious moments in putting forward arguments to turn him from his murderous purpose. "I have lived too ungodly a life," I protested, "to be able to squeeze into paradise through so narrow a gate. As you would hope for your own ultimate salvation, Excellency, I do beseech you not to imperil mine." This disposed him at least to listen to me, and proceeded to assure him of the harmless nature of my visit to the hall, in quest of wine to quench my thirst. I was running the grave risk of dying with lies on my lips, but I was too desperate to give the matter thought just then. His mood seemed to relent. The delay perhaps had calmed his first access of passion, and he was grown more reasonable. But when Ramiro cooled, he was, perhaps, more malignant than ever, for it meant a return to natural condition, and Ramiro's natural condition was one of cruelty unsurpassed. "It may be as you say," he answered me at last, sheathing his dagger, "and at least you have my word that I will not slay you without first assuring myself that you have lied. For tonight you shall remain in durance. Tomorrow we will apply the question to you." The hope that had been reviving in my breast fell dead once more, and I turned cold at that threat. And yet, between now and tomorrow, much might betide, and I had cause for thankfulness, perhaps, for this respite. Thus I sought to cheer myself, but I fear I failed. Tomorrow he would torture me, not so much to ascertain whether I had spoken truly, but because, to his diseased mind, it afforded diversion to witness a man's anguish. No doubt it was that had urged him now to spare my life, and to accord me this merciless piece of mercy. In a loud voice he called the sentry who was pacing below, and in a moment the man appeared in answer to that summons. "You will take this knave to the chamber set apart for him up there, and you will leave him secure under lock and bar, bringing me the key of his door." The fellow informed himself which was the chamber, then turning to me he curtly bade me go with him. Thus was I haled back to my room, with the promise of horrors on the morrow, but with the night before me in which to scheme and pray for some miracle that might yet save me. But the days of miracles were long past. I lay on my bed and deplored with many a sigh that bitter fact. And if aught had been wanting to increase the weight of fear and anguish on my already overburdened mind, and to aid in what almost seemed an infernal plot to utterly distract me, I had it in fresh wild conjectures touching Madonna Paola. Where indeed could she be, that Ramiro's men had failed to find her, for all that they had scoured that part of the country in which I had left her to wait for my return? What if by now worse had befallen her than the capture with which Ramiro's lieutenant was charged? With such doubts as these to haunt me, fretted as I was by my utter inability to take a step in her service, I lay there for an hour or so in such agony of mind as is begotten only of suspense. In my girdle still reposed the treasonable letter from Vitelli to Ramiro, a mighty weapon with which to accomplish the butcher's overthrow. But how was I to wield it imprisoned here? I wondered why Mariani had not returned, only to remember that the soldier who had locked me in had carried the key of my prison chamber to Ramiro. Suddenly the stillness was disturbed by a faint tap at my door. My instincts and my reason told me it must be Mariani at last. In an instant I had leapt from the bed and whispered through the keyhole, "Who is there?" "It is I, Mariani, the Seneschal," came the old man's voice very softly, but nevertheless distinctly. "They have taken the key." I groaned. Then in a gust of passion I fell to cursing Ramiro for that precaution. "You have the letter," came Mariani's voice again. I have it still," I answered. "Have you seen what it contains?" "A plot to assassinate the Duke, no less. Enough to get this bloody Ramiro broken on the wheel." I was answered by a sound that was as a gasp of malicious joy. Then the old man's voice added, "Can you pass it under the door? There is a sufficient gap." I felt and found that he was right. I could pass the half of my hand underneath. I took the letter and thrust it through. His hands fastened on it instantly, almost snatching it from my fingers before they were ready to release it. "Have courage," he bade me. "Listen. I shall endeavour to leave Cesena in the morning, and I shall ride straight for Faenza. If I find the Duke there when I arrive, he should be here within some 12 or 14 hours of my departure. Fence with Ramiro, temporize if you can till then, and all will be well with you. I will do what I can, I answered him, but if he slays me in the meantime, at least I shall have the satisfaction of knowing that he will not be long in following me. May God shield you, he said fervently. May God speed you, I answered him with a still greater fervour. That night, as you may well conceive, I slept but little, and that little ill. The morning, instead of relieving the fears that in the darkness had been with me, seemed to increase them, for now was the time for Mariani to act, and I was fearful as to how he might succeed. I was full of doubts lest some obstacle should have arisen to prevent his departure from Cesena, and I spent my morning in wearisome speculation. I took an almost childish satisfaction in the thought that since, being a prisoner, I could no longer count myself the fool of the court of Cesena, I was free to strip the motley and to assume the more sober garments in which I had been taken, and which, as you may recall, had been placed in my chamber on the previous evening. It was the very plainest raiment. For doublet I wore a buff brigandine, quilted and dagger-proof, and caught at the waist by a girdle of hammered steel. My wine-coloured hose was stout and serviceable, as were my long boots of untanned leather. Yet prouder was I of this sober apparel than ever a king of his ermine. It may have been an hour or so past noon, when at last my solitude was invaded by a soldier who came to order me into the presence of the governor. I had been sitting at the window, leaning against the bars, and looking out at the desolate white landscape, for there had been a heavy fall of snow in the night, which reminded me, as snow ever did, of my first meeting with Madonna Paola. I rose upon the instant, and my fears rose with me, but I kept a bold front as I went down into the hall, where Ramiro and the blackguards of his court were sitting, with 3 or 4 men-at-arms at attention by the door. Close to the pulleys appertaining to the torture of the cord stood 2 leather-clad ruffians, Ramiro's executioners. At the head of the board, which was still strewn with fragments of food, for they had but dined, sat Ramiro dell'Oca. With him were 6 of his officers, whose villainous appearance pronounced them worthy of their brutal leader. The air was heavy with the pungent odour of viands. I looked around for Mariani, and I took some comfort from the fact that he was absent. Might heaven please that he was even then on his way to Faenza. Ramiro watched my advance with a smile in which mockery was blent with satisfaction. For all that of the resumption of my proper raiment, he seemed to take no heed. No doubt he had dined well, and he was now disposing himself to be amused. "Messer Boccadoro," said he, when I came to a standstill, "there was last night a matter that was not cleared up between us, and concerning which I expressed an intention of questioning you today. I should proceed to do so at once, were it not that there is yet another matter on which I am, if possible, still more desirous you should tell us all you know. Once already have you evaded my questions, with answers which at the time I half believed. Even now I do not say that I utterly disbelieve them, but I wish to assure myself that you told the truth. For if you lied, why then we may still be assisted by such information the cord shall squeeze from you. I am referring to the mysterious disappearance of Madonna Paola De Santafiore, a disappearance of which you have assured me that you knew nothing, being even in ignorance of the fact that the lady was not really dead. I had confidently expected that the party searching for Madonna Paola would have succeeded ere this in finding her, But this morning my hopes suffered disappointment. My men have returned empty-handed once more. For which mercy may heaven be praised, I burst out. He scowled at me, and then he laughed evilly. My men have returned all save 3. Captain Lucagnolo, with 2 of his followers, has undertaken to go beyond the area I pointed for the search, and to proceed to the village of Cattolica. While he is pursuing his inquiries there, I have resolved to pursue my own here. I now call upon you, Boccadoro, to tell us what you know of Madonna Paola's whereabouts. I know nothing, I answered stoutly. I am prepared to take oath that I know nothing of her whereabouts. Tell me, then, at least, said he, where you bestowed her. I shook my head, pressing my lips tight. Do you think that I would tell you if I had the knowledge, was the scornful question with which I answered him. You may pursue your inquiries as you will and where you will. But I pray God they may all prove as futile as must those that you would pursue here, and upon my own person. This was how I fenced with him. This was the manner in which I followed Mariani's sound advice that I should temporize. Oh, I know that my words were the words of a fool, yet no fear that Ramiro could inspire me could have restrained them. There was a murmur at the table, and his fellows turned their eyes on Ramiro to see how he would receive this bearding. He smiled quietly, and raising his hand he made a sign to the executioners. Rude hands seized me from behind, and the doublet was torn from my back by fingers that never paused to untruss my points. They turned me about and hurried me along until I stood under the pulleys of the torture. One of the men held me securely, whilst the other passed the cords about my wrists. Then both the executioners stepped back, to be ready to hoist me at the governor's signal. He delayed it, much as an epicure delays the consumption of a delectable morsel, heightening by suspense the keen desire of his palate. He watched me closely, and had my lips quivered or my eyelids fluttered, he would have hailed with joy such signs of weakness. But I take pride in truthfully writing that I stood bold and impassively before him, and if I was pale, I thank heaven that pallor was the habit of my countenance, so that from that he could gather no satisfaction, and standing there, I gave him back look for look, and waited. For the last time, Boccadoro, he said slowly, attempting by words to shake a demeanour that was proof against the impending facts of the cord. I ask you to remember what must be the consequences of this stubbornness. If not at the first hoist, why, then, at the second or the third, the torture will compel you to disclose what you may know. Would you not be better advised to speak at once, while your limbs are soundly planted in their sockets, rather than let yourself be maimed, perhaps for life, ere you will do so? There was a stir of hoofs without. They thundered on the planks of the drawbridge, and clattered on the stones of the courtyard. The thought of Cesare Borgia rose to my mind, but never did drowning man clutch at a more illusory straw. Cold reason quenched my hope at once. If the greatest imaginable success attended Mariani's journey, the Duke could not reach Cesena before midnight, and to that it wanted some 10 hours at least. Moreover, the company that came was small, to judge by the sound, a half-dozen horses at the most. But Ramiro's attention had been diverted from me by the noise. Half turning in his chair, he called to one of the men-at-arms to ascertain who came. Before the fellow could do his bidding, the door was thrust open, and Lucagnolo appeared on the threshold, jaded and worn with hard riding. A certain excitement arose in me at sight of him. despite my confidence that he must be returning empty-handed. Ramiro rose, pushed back his chair, and advanced towards the newcomer. "Well," he demanded, "what news?" "Excellency, the girl is here." That answer seemed to turn me into stone, so great was the shock of this sudden shattering of the confidence that had sustained me. "My search in the country failing," pursued the captain as he came forward, "I made bold to exceed your orders by pushing my inquiries as far as the village of Cattolica. There I found her after some little labour." Surely I dreamt. Surely, I told myself, this was not possible. There was some mistake. Lucanolo had brought some wench whom he believed to be Madonna Paola. But even as I was assuring myself of this, the door opened again, and between two men-at-arms, white as death, her garments stained with mud, and all but reduced to rags, and her eyes wild with a great fear, came my beloved Paola. With a sound that was as a grunt of satisfaction, Ramiro strode forward to meet her. But her eyes travelled past him and rested upon me, standing there between the leather-clad executioners, with the cords of the torture pinioning my wrists, and I saw the anguish deepen in their blue depths. End of chapter 18, May 2025. Chapter 19, The Shame of Motley, by Rafael Sabatini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 19, Doomed. Across the length of that hall, our eyes met, hers and mine, and held each other's glances. To me, the room and all within it formed an indistinct and misty picture, from out of which there clearly gleamed my Paola's sweet white face. All at the table had risen with Ramiro, and now, copying their leader, they bared their heads in outward token of such respect as certainly would have been felt by any men less abandoned than were they before so much saintly beauty and distress. Lucanolo had stepped aside, and Ramiro was now bowing low and ceremoniously before Madonna. His face I could not see, since his back was towards me, but his tones, as they floated across the hall to where I stood, came laden with subservience. "Madonna, I give praise and thanks to heaven for this," said he. "I was afflicted by the gravest misgivings for your safety, and I am more than thankful to behold you safe and sound." There was a hypocritical flavour of courtliness about his words, and a mincing of his tones that suggested the efforts of a bull-calf to imitate the warbling of a throstle. Madonna paid him no heed. Indeed, she appeared not to have heard him, for her eyes continued to look past him and at me. At last her lips parted, and although she scarcely seemed to raise her voice above a whisper, the word uttered reached my ears across the stillness of the great room, and the word was, "Lazzaro." At mention of my name, and at the tone in which it was uttered, a tone that betrayed some measure of what was in her heart, Ramiro wheeled sharply in my direction, his brows wrinkling. A certain craftiness he had, for all that I ever accounted him the dullest witted clod that ever rose to his degree of honour. He must have realized how expedient it was that in all he did he should present himself to Madonna in a favourite light. "Release him," he bade the executioners that held me, and in an instant I was set free. The order given, he turned again to Madonna. "You have been torturing him," she cried, and her words were hard and fierce, her eyes blazing. "You shall repent it, Sir Ramiro. The Lord Cesare Borgia shall hear of it." Her anger betrayed her more and more, and however hidden it may have been to her, to me it was exceeding clear that she was encompassing my destruction. Ramiro laughed easily. "Madonna, you are at fault. We have not been torturing him, though I confess that we were on the point of putting him to the question. But your timely arrival has saved his limbs, for the question we were asking him concerned your whereabouts." I would have shouted to her to be wary of how she answered him, for some premonition how he was about to trick her entered my mind. But realizing the futility of such a course, I held my peace and waited agonizedly. "You had tortured him in vain, then," she answered scornfully, "for Lazzaro Biancamonte would never have betrayed me, nor could he have betrayed me if he would. For after your men had searched the hut in which I was hidden, I walked to Cattolica, thinking foolishly that I should be safer there." Lack a day! She had told him the very thing he had sought to know. Yet, to make doubly sure, he pursued the scent a little further. "Indeed, it seems to me that had I tortured him, I had given him no more than he deserved for having abandoned you in that hut, Madonna. I tremble to think of the harm that might have come to you through that knave's desertion." And he scowled across at me, much as the Pharisee might have scowled upon the publican. "He is no knave," she answered, and I could have groaned to hear her working my undoing, though not by so much as a sign might I inspire her with caution, for that sign must have been seen by others. "Nor did he abandon me. He left me only to go in quest of the necessaries for our journey. If harm has come to me, the blame of it must not rest on him." "Of what harm do you speak, Madonna?" he cried in a voice laden with concern. "Of what harm?" she echoed, eyeing him with a scorn that would have slain him had he any manhood left. "Of what harm? Mother of mercy, defend me. Do you ask the question? What greater harm could have come to me than to have fallen into the hands of Ramiro del Orca and his brigands?" He stood looking at her, and I doubt not that his face was a very picture of simulated consternation. "Surely, Madonna, you do not understand that we are your friends, that you can so abuse us." "But you will be faint, Madonna," he cried with a fresh and deep solicitude. "A cup of wine," and he waved his hand towards the table. "It would poison me, I think," she answered coldly. "You are cruel, and, alas, mistrustful," said he. "Can you guess nothing of the anxiety that has been mine these 2 days, of the fears that have haunted me as I thought of you and your wanderings?" Her lip curled, and her face took on some slight vestige of colour. Her spirit was a thing for which I might then have come to love her, had it not been that already I loved her to distraction. "Yes," said she, "I can guess something of your dismay when you found your schemes frustrated, when you found that you had come too late to San Domenico. Will you not forgive me that shift to which my adoration drove me?" he implored in a honeyed voice. And a more fearful thing than Ramiro the butcher was Ramiro the lover. At that scarcely covert avowal of his passion, she recoiled a step, as she might before a thing unclean. The little colour faded from her cheek, the scorn departed from her lip, and a sickly, deadly fear overspread her lovely face. God! that I should stand there and witness this insult to the woman I adored and worshipped with a fervour that the Church seeks to instil into us for those about the throne of heaven. It might not be. A blind access of fury took me. Of the consequences I thought nothing. Reason left me utterly, and the slight hope that might lie in temporizing was disregarded. Before those about me could guess my purpose, or those others too engrossed in the scene at the far end of the hall could intervene, I had sprung from between the executioners and dashed across the space that separated me from the governor of Cesena. One well-aimed blow, and there should be an end to Messer Ramiro. That was the only thought that found room in my disordered mind. One or two there were who cried out as I sped past them, swift as the hound when it speeds after the fleeing hare. But I was upon Ramiro ere any could have sufficiently mastered his surprise to interfere. By the nape of his great neck I caught him from behind, and setting my knee at his spine I wrenched him backward, and so flung him over on the floor. Down I went with him, my hand reaching for the dagger at his jewelled girdle, and I had found and drawn it in that swift action of mine ere he had bethought him of his hands. Up it flashed and down. I sank it through the crimson velvet of his rich doublet, straight at the spot where his heart should be, if he were so human as to have a heart. The next instant I turned cold and sick. My desperate effort had been all for nothing. In my hand I was left with the bronze hilt of his great poniard. The blade had broken off against the mesh of steel the coward wore beneath his finery. There was a rush of feet about us, a piercing scream from Madonna Paola, and it was to her that I owed my life in that grim moment. A dozen blades were naked, and would have transfixed me as I lay, but that she covered my body with her own, and bade them strike at me through her. A moment later, and the powerful hands of the governor of Cesena were at my throat. I was lifted and tossed aside as though I had been a hound, and he the bull I had beset. And as he swung me over and crushed me to the ground, he knelt above me and grinned horribly into my purpling face. A second we stayed so, and I thought indeed that my hour was come, when suddenly I felt the blood in my head released once more. He had taken his hands from my throat. He seized me now by the collar and dragged me rudely to my feet. "Take this knave and lock him in his chamber," he bade a couple of his bravi. "I may have need of him ere he dies." "Messer Ramiro," came the interceding voice of Madonna Paola. "What he did for me. You will not let him die for it." There was a pause, during which he looked at her, whilst the men were roughly dragging me across the hall. "Who knows, Madonna," he said, with a bow and an infernal smile. "If you were to beg his life, it might even come to pass that I might spare it." He did not wait for her answer, but stepping after me, he called to the men that led me. In obedience they halted, and he came forward. We were now at the foot of the staircase. "Boccadoro," said he, planting himself before me and eyeing me with eyes that were very full of malice. "You will recall the punishment I promised you if I came to discover it was you had thwarted me in Pesaro. It is the second time you have fooled Ramiro dell'Oca. There does not live the man who can boast that he did it thrice, nor will I risk it that you be that man. Make your peace with heaven, for at sunset, in an hour's time, you hang." There is one little thing that might save you even yet, and if you find life sweet, you would do well to pray that that little thing may come to pass. I answered him nothing, but I bowed my head in token that I had heard, and he signed to the men to proceed with me, whilst turning on his heel, he stepped down the hall again to where Madonna Paola, overcome with weakness, had sunk upon a stool. As I was leaving the gallery, I had a last glimpse of her, sitting there with drawn face and haggard eyes that followed me as I passed from her sight, whilst Ramiro del Orca stood beside her, murmuring words that did not reach me. His so-called courtiers and his men-at-arms were trooping out of the room, no doubt in obedience to his dismissal. End of Chapter 19, May 2025. Chapter 20, The Shame of Motley, by Rafael Sabatini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, The Sunset. I have heard tell of the calm that comes upon brave men when hope is dead and their doom has been pronounced. Uncertainty may have tortured and made cowards of them, but once that uncertainty is dissolved and suspense is at an end, resignation enters their soul, and, possessing it, gives to their bearing a noble and dignified peace. By the mercy of heaven they are made, maybe, to see how poor and evanescent a thing is life, and they come to realize that since to die is a necessity there is no avoiding, as well might it be tied today as 10 years hence. Such a mood, however, came not to soothe that last hour of mine, and yet I account myself no coward. It was an hour of such torture and anguish as never before I had experienced, much though I had undergone, and the source of all my suffering lay in the fact that Madonna Paola was in the hands of the ogre of Cesena. Had it not been for that most untoward circumstance, I almost believe that while I waited for the sun to set on that December afternoon, my mood had not only been calm, but even in some measure joyous. For it must have comforted my last moments to reflect that for all that Messer Ramiro was about to hang me, yet had I sown the seeds of his own destruction, ere he had brought me to this pass. I did indeed reflect upon it, and it may even be that, in spite of all, I culled some grain of comfort from the reflection. But let that be. My narrative would drag wearily were I to digress that I might tell you at length the ugly course of my thoughts, whilst the sands of my last hour were running swiftly out. For, after all, my concern and yours is with the story of Lazzaro Biancamonte, sometime known as Boccadoro the Fool, and not with his philosophies so unprofitable that it can benefit no man that I should set them down. My windows faced west, and so I was able to watch the fall of the sun, and measure by its shortening distance from the horizon the ebbing of my poor life. At last the nether rim of that round fiery orb was on the point of touching the line of distant hills, and it was casting a crimson glow along the white, snow-sheeted landscape that was singularly suggestive of a tide of blood, a very fitting tide to flow and ebb about the walls of the castle of Cesena. One little thing there was might save me, Ramiro had said, but I had shut the thought out of my mind to keep me from utter distraction. The only little thing in which I held that my salvation could lie would be in the miraculous arrival of Cesare Borgia, and of that not the faintest hope existed. If the greatest luck attended Mariani's errand, and the greatest speed were made by the Duke once he received the letter, he could not reach Cesena in less than another 8 hours, and another 8 minutes, to reckon by the swift sinking of the sun, would seem the time appointed for my hanging. I thought of Joshua in that grim hour, and in a mood that approached the whimsical I envied him his gift. If I could have stayed the setting of the sun, and held it where it was till midnight, all might yet be well if Mariani had been diligent, and Cesare swift. The key grating in the lock put an end to my vague musings, and reminded me of the fact that I had neglected to employ that last hour as would have become a good son of Mother Church. For an instant I believe that my heart turned me to thoughts of God, and sent up a prayer for mercy for my poor sinful soul. Then the door swung wide. Two halberdiers and a carnifex in his odious leathern apron stood before me. Clearly Ramiro thought to be exact, and to have me hanging the instant the sun should vanish. "It is time," said one of the soldiers, whilst the executioner, stepping into my chamber, pinioned my wrists behind me, and retaining hold of the cord, bade me march. He followed, holding that slender cord, and so, like a beast to the shambles, went I. Once more they led me into the hall where the shadows were lengthening, in dark contrast to the splashes of sunlight that lingered on the floor, and whose blood-red hue was deepening by the jewels of the windows through which it was filtered. Ramiro was waiting for me, and 6 of his officers were in attendance. But, for once, there were no men-at-arms at hand. On a chair, the one usually occupied by Ramiro himself, sat Madonna Paola, still in her torn and bedraggled raiment, her face white, her eyes wild as they had been when first she had been haled into Ramiro's presence some 2 hours ago, and her features so rigidly composed that it told the tale of the awful self-control she must be exerting, a self-control that might end with a sudden snap that would plunge her into madness. A wild rage possessed me at sight of her. Let Ramiro be ruthless and cruel where men are concerned. That was a thing for which forgiveness might be found him. But that he should submit a lady, delicately nurtured as was Madonna, to such horrors as she had undergone since she had awakened from his sleeping potion in the church of San Domenico, was something for which no hell could punish him condignly. Ramiro met me with a countenance, through the assumed gravity of which I could espy his wicked infernal mockery peeping forth. "I deplore your end, Lazzaro Biancamonte," said he slowly, "for you are a brave man, and brave men are rare. You were worthy of better things, but you chose to cross swords with Ramiro dell'Oca, and you have got your death blow. May God have mercy on your soul." "I am praying," said I, "for just so much mercy as you shall have justice. If my prayer is heard, I should be well content." He changed countenance a little. So too, I thought, did Madonna Paola. My firmness may have yielded her some grain of comfort. Ramiro set his hands on his hips and eyed me squarely. "You are a dauntless rogue," he confessed. I laughed for answer, and in that moment it entered my mind that I might yet enjoy some measure of revenge in this life. More than that, I might benefit Madonna, for were the seed I was about to sow to take root in the craven heart of Ramiro dell'Oca, it would so fully occupy his mind that he would have little time to bestow on Paola in the few hours that were left him. But before I could bethink me of words, he was speaking again. "I held out to you a slender hope," said he. "I told you that there was one little thing might save you. That hope has borne no fruit. The little thing I spoke of has not come to pass. It rested with Madonna Paola here. She had it in her hands to effect your salvation, but she has refused. Your blood rests on her head." She shuddered at the words, and a low moan escaped her. She covered her face with her hands. A moment I stood looking at her. Then I shifted my glance to Ramiro. "Will it please you, illustrious, to allow me a few moments' conversation with Madonna Paola De Santafiore?" I invested my tones with a weight of meaning that did not escape him. His face suddenly lightened, whilst one of his officers, a fellow very fitly named Lupone, laughed outright. "Your hero seems none so heroic after all," he said derisively to the governor. "The imminence of death makes him amenable." Ramiro scowled on him for answer, then turning to me, "Do you think you could bend her stubbornness?" quoth he. "I might attempt it," answered I. His eyes flashed with evil hope, his lips parted in a smile. He shot a glance at Madonna, who had withdrawn her hands from her face, and was regarding me now with a strange expression of horror and incredulity, marvelling, no doubt, to find me such a craven as I must have seemed. Ramiro looked at the diminishing sunlight on the floor. "In some 5 minutes the sun will have completely set," said he. "Those 5 minutes you shall have to seek to enlist Madonna's aid on your behalf. If you succeed, she may tell you on what terms you are to have your life. You shall depart from Cesena tonight, a free man." He paused a moment, and his eyes, lighted by an odious smile, rested once more on Madonna Paola. Then he bade all withdraw, and went with them into an adjoining chamber, fondly nurturing the hopes that were begotten of his belief that Lazzaro Biancamonte was a villain. When we were alone, she and I stood a moment where they had left me, my hands pinioned behind me, and the cord which the executioner had held trailing the ground like a lambent tail. Then I went slowly forward until I stood close before her. Her eyes were on my face, still with that same look of unbelief. "Madonna mia," said I, "do not for an instant think that it is my purpose to ask of you any sacrifice that might save my worthless life. Rather was my purpose in seeking these few moments with you to strengthen and encourage you by such news as it is mine to bring." She looked now as if she scarcely understood. "If I will wed him tonight, he has promised that you shall go free," she said in a whisper. "He says that he can bring a priest from the neighbourhood at a moment's notice." "Do not heed him," I cried sternly. "I do not heed him," she said more composedly. "If he seeks to force me, I shall find a way of setting myself free. Dear Mother of Heaven, death were a sweet and restful thing after all that I have suffered in these days." And then she fell suddenly to weeping. "Think me not an utter coward, Lazzaro. Willingly would I do this thing to save so noble a life as yours, did I not think that you must hate me for it. I was stout and firm in my refusal, confident that you would have had me so. Was I not right, my poor, poor Lazzaro?" "Madonna, you were right," I answered firmly and calmly. "And you are to die, amore mio," she murmured passionately. "You are to die when the promise of happiness seemed held out to us. And yet, were you to live at the price at which life is offered you, would your life be endurable? Tell me the truth, Lazzaro, swear it to me, for if life is the dearer thing to you, why, then, you shall have your life." "Need you ask me, Paola?" questioned I. "Does not your heart tell you how much easier is death than would be such life as I must lead hereafter, even if we could trust Ramiro, which we cannot? Be brave, Madonna, and help me to be brave, and bear thyself with a becoming fortitude. Now listen to what I have to tell you. Ramiro del Orca is a traitor who is plotting the death of his overlord. Proofs of it are by now in the hands of Cesare Borgia, and in some 7 or 8 hours the Duke himself should be here to put this monster to the question touching these matters. I will say a word in his ear ere I depart that will fill his mind with very wholesome fear, and you will find that during the next few hours left him, he will have little leisure to think of you, and afflict you with his odious wooing. Be strong, then, for a little while, for Cesare is coming to set you free." She looked at me now with eyes that were wide open. Suddenly, "Could we not gain time?" she cried. And in her eagerness she rose and set her hands upon my shoulders. "Could I not pretend to acquiesce to his wishes, and so delay your end?" "I have thought of it," I answered gloomily, "but the thought has brought me no hope. Ramiro is not to be trusted. He might tell you that he sets me free, but he dare not do so. He fears that I may have knowledge of his dealings with Vitelli, and assuredly he would break faith with us. Again, the coming of the Duke might be delayed. Alas," I ended in despair, "there is nothing to be done but let things run their course." There was even more in my mind than I expressed. My mistrust of Ramiro went further than I had explained, and concerning Madonna more closely than it did me. "Nay, Lazzaro mine," she still protested, "I will attempt it. It is at least well worth the risk." "You forget," said I, "that even when Cesare comes, we cannot say how he will bear himself towards you. You were to have been betrothed to his cousin Ignacio. It is a matter upon which he may insist." She looked at me for a moment with anguish in her eyes that turned my misery into torture. "Lazzaro," she moaned, "was ever woman so beset? I think that heaven must have laid some curse upon me." Her face was close to mine. I stooped forward and kissed her on her brow. "May God have you in his keeping, Madonna mia," I murmured. "The sun is gone." "Lazzaro!" It was the cry of a breaking heart. Her arms went round my neck, and in a passion of grief her kisses burned on my lips. And then the door of the anteroom opened, and I thanked God for the mercy of that interruption. I whispered a word to her, and in obedience she sprang back and sank limp and broken on the chair once again. Ramiro entered, his men behind him, his face alit with eagerness. There and then I swamped his hopes. "The sun is gone, magnificent," said I. "You had best get me hanged." His brow darkened, for there was a note of mockery and triumph in my voice. "You have fooled me, animal," he cried. His jaw set, and his eyes continued to regard me with an evil glow. Then he laughed terribly, shrugged his shoulders, and spoke again. "After all, it shall avail you little." He turned to the carnifex. "Federigo, do your work," said he. Whereupon the fellow stepped behind me, and the halberdiers ranged themselves one on either side of me again. "A word ere I go, Messer dell'Orca," I demanded insolently. He looked at me sharply, wondering, maybe, at the fresh tone I took. "Say it and be gone," he sullenly permitted me. I paused a moment to choose fitting words for that portentous death song of mine. At length, "You boasted to me a little while ago," said I, smiling grimly, "that the man did not live who had thrice fooled you. That man does live, for that man am I." "Bah!" he returned contemptuously, thinking, no doubt, that I referred to my interview with Madonna Paola. "You may take what pride you will from such a thought. You are upon the threshold of death." "True, but the thought is one that affords me more comfort and joy than pride. As much comfort and joy as you shall take horror when I tell you in what manner I have fooled you." I paused to heighten the sensation of my words. "To such good purpose have I used my wits, that ere another sun shall rise and set, you will have followed me along the black road that I am now treading, the road whose bourne is the gallows. Bethink you of the charred paper that last night you brushed from this table, when you awoke to find a candle fallen on the treacherous letter Vitellozzo Vitelli sent you in the lining of a hat?" His jaw fell, his face flamed redder than ever for a second, and then it went grey as ashes. "Of what do you prate, fool?" he questioned huskily, seeking to bluster it before the startled glances of his officers. "I speak," said I, "of that charred paper. It was I who laid the candle across it, but it was a virgin sheet I burned. Vitelli's letter I had first abstracted." "You lie!" he almost screamed. "To prove that I do not, I will tell you what it contained. It held proof that, bribed by the tyrant of Città del Castello, you had undertaken to pose an arbalista to slay the Duke on the occasion of his coming visit to Cesena." He glared at me a moment in furious amazement. Then he turned to his officers. "Do not heed him," he bade them. "The dog lies to sow doubts in your mind ere he goes out to hang. It is a puerile revenge." I laughed with amused confidence. There was one among them had heard Lampugnani's words touching the messenger's hat, words that had cost the fellow his life. But my concern was little with the effect my words might produce upon his followers. "By tomorrow you will know whether I have lied or not. Nay, before then shall you know it. For by midnight Cesare Borgia should be in Cesena. Vitelozzo Vitelli's letter is in his hands by now." At that Ramiro burst into a laugh. So convinced was he of the impossibility of my having got the letter to the Duke, even if what I had said of its abstraction were true, that he gathered assurance from what seemed to him so monstrous an exaggeration. "By your own words are you confounded," said he. "Out of your own mouth have you proven your lies. Assuming that all you say were true, how could you, who since last night have been a prisoner, have got a messenger to bear anything from you to Cesare Borgia?" I looked at him with a contemptuous amusement that daunted him. "Where is Mariani?" I asked quietly. "Where is the father of the lad you so brutally and wantonly slew yesternight? Seek him throughout Cesena, and when you find him not, perhaps you will realize that one who had seen his own son suffer such an outrageous and cruel death at your brigand's hands would be a willing and ready instrument in an act that should avenge him." Vergine Santa! What a consternation was his! He must have missed Mariani early in the day, for he took no measure, asked no questions that might confirm or refute the thing I announced. His face grew livid, and his knees loosened. He sank onto a chair and mopped the cold sweat from his brow with his great brown hand. No thought had he now for the eyes of his officers or their opinions. Fear, icy and horrid, such fear as in his time he had inspired in 1,000 hearts, was now possessed of his. Sweet, indeed, was the flavour of my vengeance. His officers instinctively drew away from him before the guilt so clearly written on his face, and their eyes were full of doubt as to how they should proceed, and of some fear, for it must have been passing through their minds that they stood themselves in danger of being involved with him in the Duke's punishment of his disloyalty. This was more than had ever entered into my calculations, or found room in my hopes. By a brisk appeal to them, it almost seemed that I might work my salvation in this 11th hour. Madonna watched the scene, with eyes that suggested to me that the same hope had risen in her own mind. My halberdiers and the carnifux alone stood solidly indifferent. Ramiro was to them the man that hired them. With his intriguing they had no concern. For a moment or two there was a silence, and Ramiro sat staring before him, his white face glistening with the sweat of fear. A very coward at heart was this overbearing ogre of Cesena, who for years had been the terror and scourge of the countryside. At last he mastered his emotions and sprang to his feet. "You have had the laugh of me," he snarled, fury now ringing in his voice, "but ere you die you may regret it that you mocked me." He turned to the executioner. "Strip him," he commanded fiercely. "He shall not hang as I intended, at least not before we have torn every bone of his body from its socket. To the cord with him!" And he pointed to the torture at the end of the hall. The executioner made shift to obey him, when suddenly Madonna Paola leapt to her feet, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright with a new excitement. "Is there none here," she cried, appealing to Ramiro's officers, "that will draw his sword in the service of his overlord, the Duke of Valentino? There stands a traitor, and there one who has proven his loyalty to Cesare Borgia. The Duke is likely to demand a heavy price for the life of that faithful one, to whose warning he owes his escape of assassination. Will none of you side now with the right, that anon you may stand well with Cesare Borgia when he comes? Or, by idly allowing this traitor to have his way, will you participate in this punishment that must be his?" It was the very spur they needed, and scarce was that final question of hers flung at these knaves when the answer came from one of them. It was that same sturdy Lupone. "I, for one, am for the Duke," said he, and his sword leapt from its scabbard. "I draw my iron for Valentino. Let every loyal man do likewise and seize this traitor." And with his sword he pointed at Ramiro. In an instant 3 others bared their weapons and ranged themselves beside him. The remaining 2, of whom was Lucagnolo, folded their hands, manifesting by that impassivity that they were minded to take neither one side nor the other. The Carnifex paused in his labours of undressing me, and the affair promised to grow interesting. But Ramiro did not stand his ground. Fury swelling his veins and crimsoning his huge face, he sprang to the door and bellowed to his guards. 6 men trooped in almost at once, and reinforced by the halberdiers that had been guarding me, they made short work of the resistance of those 4 officers. In as little time as it takes me to record it, they were disarmed and ranged against the wall behind those guards and others that had come to their support, to be dealt with by Ramiro after he had dealt with me. His fear of Cesare's coming was put by for the moment in his fierce lust to be avenged upon me, who had betrayed him, and the officers who had turned against him. Madonna sank back once more in her despair. The little spark that she had so bravely fanned to life had been quenched almost as soon as it had shown itself. "Now, Federico," said Ramiro grimly, "I am waiting." The executioner resumed his work, and in an instant I stood stripped of my brigandine. As the fellow led me unresisting to the torture, for what resistance could have availed me now, I tried to pray for strength to endure what was to come. I was done with life. For some portion of an hour I must go through the cruelest of agonies, and then, when it pleased God in his mercy that I should swoon, it would be to wake no more in this world, for they would bear out my unconscious body and hang it by the neck from that black beam they called Ramiro del Orca's flagstaff. I cast a last glance at Madonna. She had fallen on her knees, and with folded hands was praying intently, none heeding her. Federico hauled me beneath the pulleys, and his horrid hands grew busy adjusting the ropes to my wrists. And then, when the last ray of hope had faded, but before the executioner had completed his hideous task, a trumpet blast, winding a challenge to the gates of the castle of Cesena, suddenly rang out upon the evening air, and startled us all by its sudden and imperious note. End of chapter 20, May 2025. Chapter 21, The Shame of Motley, by Rafael Sabatini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Ave Caesar. For just an instant I allowed myself to be tortured by the hope that a miracle had happened, and here was Cesare Borgia, come a good 8 hours before it was possible for Mariani to have fetched him from Faenza. The same doubt may have crossed Ramiro's mind, for he changed colour and sprang to the door to bawl an order forbidding his men to lower the bridge. But he was too late. Before he was answered by his followers, we heard the creaking of the hinges and the rattle of the running chains, ending in a thud that told us the drawbridge had dropped across the moat. Then came the loud, continuous thunder of many hoofs upon its timbers. Paralysed by fear, Ramiro stood where he had halted, turning his eyes wildly in this direction and in that, but never moving one way or the other. It must be Cesare, I swore to myself. Who else could ride into Cesena with such numbers? But then, if it was Cesare, it could not be that he had seen Mariani, for he could not have ridden from Faenza. Madonna had risen too, and with a white face and straining eyes she was looking towards the door. And then our doubts were at last ended. There was a jangle of spurs and the fall of feet, and through the open door stepped a straight, martial figure in a doublet of deep crimson velvet, trimmed with costly lynx furs and slashed with satin in the sleeves and shoulder puffs. Jewels gleamed in the massive chain across his breast and at the American girdle that carried his bronze-hilted sword. His hose was of red silk, and his great black boots were armed with golden spurs. But to crown all this very regal splendour was the beautiful, pale, cold face of Cesare Borgia, from out of which 2 black eyes flashed and played like sword points on the company. Behind him surged a press of mercenaries in steel, their weapons naked in their hands, so that no doubt was left of the character of this visit. Collecting himself, and bethinking him that after all he had best dissemble a good countenance, Ramiro advanced respectfully to meet his overlord. But ere he had taken 3 steps, the Duke stayed him. "Stand where you are, traitor," was the imperious command. "I'll trust you no nearer to my person." And to emphasize his words, he raised his gloved left hand, which had been resting on his sword hilt, and in which I now observed that he held a paper. Whether Ramiro recognized it, or whether it was that the mere sight of a paper reminded him of the letter which on my testimony should be in Cesare's keeping, or whether again the word traitor, with which Cesare branded him, drove the iron deeper into his soul, I cannot say. But to this I can testify, that he turned a livid green, and stood there before his formidable master in an attitude so stricken as to have aroused pity for any man less a villain than was he. And now Cesare's eye, travelling around, alighted on Madonna Paola, standing back in the shadows to which she had instinctively withdrawn at his coming. At sight of her he recoiled a pace, deeming, no doubt, that it was an apparition stood before him. Then he looked again, and being a man whose mind was above puerile superstitions, he assured himself that by what miracle the thing was wrought, the figure before him was the living body of Madonna Paola Sforza di Santafiore. He swept the velvet cap with its jewelled plume from off his auburn locks and bowed low before her. In God's name, Madonna, how are you come to life again? And how do I find you here, of all places?" She made no ado about enlightening him. "That villain," said she, and her finger pointed straight and firmly at Ramiro, "put a sleeping potion in my wine on the last night he dined with us at Pesaro. And when all thought me dead, he came to the church of San Domenico with his men to carry off my sleeping body. He would have succeeded in his fell design, but that Lazzaro Biancamonte there, whom you have stayed him in the act of torturing to death, was beforehand, and saved me from his clutches for a time. This morning at Cattolica his searching sbirri discovered me and brought me hither, where I have been for the past 3 hours, and where, but for your Excellency's timely arrival, I shudder to think of the indignities I might have suffered." "I thank you, Madonna, for this clear succinctness," answered Cesare coldly, as was his habit. "They say he was a passionate man, and such indeed I do believe him to have been, but even in the hottest frenzy of rage, outwardly he was ever the same, icily cold and tranquil, and this, no doubt, was the thing that made him terrible. Presently, Madonna," he pursued, "I shall ask you to tell me how it chanced that, having saved you, Messer Biancamonte did not bear you to your brother's house. But first I have business with my governor of Cesena, a score which is rendered, if possible, heavier than it already stood by this thing that you have told me." "My lord," cried out Ramiro, finding his tongue at last, "Madonna has misinformed you. I know nothing of who administered the sleeping potion. Certainly it was not I. I heard a rumour that her body had been stolen and—" "Silence!" Cesare commanded sternly. "Did I question you, dog?" His beautiful, terrible eyes fastened upon Ramiro in a glance that defied the man to answer him. Cowed like a hound at the sight of the whip, Ramiro whimpered into silence. Cesare waved his hand in his direction, half turning to the men-at-arms behind him. "Take and disarm him," was his passionless command, and while they were doing his bidding he turned to me and ordered the executioner beside me to unbind my hands and set me at liberty. "I owe you a heavy debt, Messer Biancamonte," he said without any warmth, even now that his voice was laden with a message of gratitude. "It shall be discharged. It is thanks to your daring and resource that the Seneschal Mariani was able to bring me this letter, this piece of culminating proof against Ramiro dell'Oca. It is fortunate for you that Mariani was not put to it to ride to Faenza to find me, or else I am afraid we had not reached Cesena in time to save your life. I met him some leagues this side of Faenza, as I was on my way to Senegaya." He turned abruptly to Ramiro. "In this letter, which Vitelli wrote you," said he, "it is suggested that there are others in the conspiracy. Tell me now, who are those others? See that you answer me with truth, for I shall compel proofs from you of such accusations as you may make." Ramiro looked at him with eyes rendered dull by agony. He moistened his lips with his tongue, and turning his head towards his men, "Wine!" he gasped, from very force of habit. "A cup of wine!" "Let it be supplied him," said Cesare coldly, and we all stood waiting while a servant filled him a cup. Ramiro gulped the wine avidly, never pausing until the goblet was empty. "Now," said Cesare, who had been watching him, "will it please you to answer my question?" "My lord," said Ramiro, revived and strengthened in spirit by the draught, "I must ask your Excellency to be a little plainer with me. To what conspiracy is it that you refer? I know of none. What is this letter which you say Vitelli wrote me? I take it you refer to the Lord of Città di Castello, but I can recall no letters passing between us. My acquaintance with him is of the slightest." Cesare looked at him a second. "Approach," he curtly bade him, and Ramiro came forward, one of the Borgia halberdiers on either side of him, each holding him by an arm. The Duke thrust the letter under his eyes. "Have you never seen that before?" Ramiro looked at it a moment, and his attempt at dissembling bewilderment was a ludicrous thing to witness. "Never," he said brazenly at last. Cesare folded the letter and slipped it into the breast of his doublet. From his girdle he took a second paper. He turned from Ramiro. "Don Miguel," he called. From behind his men-at-arms, a tall man, all dressed in black, stood forward. It was Cesare's Spanish captain, one whose name was as well known and as well dreaded in Italy as Cesare's own. The Duke held out to him the paper that he had produced. "You heard the question that I asked Messer dell'Orca?" he inquired. "I heard, illustrious," answered Miguel with a bow. "See that you obtain me an answer to it, as well as an account of the other matters that I have noted on this list, concerning the misappropriation of stores, the retention of taxes illicitly levied, and the wanton cruelty towards my good citizens of Cesena. Put him to the question without delay, and record me his replies. The implements are yonder." And with the same calm indifference which characterized his every word and action, Cesare pointed to the torture and turned to Madonna Paola as though he had gave the matter of Ramiro dell'Orca and his misdeeds not another thought. "Mercy, my lord!" rang now the voice of Ramiro, laden with horrid fear. "I will speak." "Then do so to Don Miguel. He will question you in my name." And again he turned to Madonna. "Madonna Paola, may I conduct you hence? Things may perhaps occur which it is not seemly your gentle eyes should witness. Messer Biancamonte, attend us." Now, in spite of all that Ramiro had made me suffer, I should have been loath to have remained and witnessed his examination. That they would torture him now was inevitable. His chance of answering freely was gone. Even if he returned meek replies to Don Miguel's questions, that gentleman would, no doubt, still submit him to the cord, by way of assuring himself that such replies were true ones. Gladly, then, did I turn to follow the Duke and Madonna Paola into the adjoining chamber, to which Cesare led the way. Even as Don Miguel's voice was raised to command his men to clear the hall, to the end that he might conduct his examination in private. The three of us stood in the anteroom. A servant had lighted the tapers and closed the doors, and the Duke turned to me. "First, Messer Biancamonte, to discharge my debt. You are, if I am not misinformed, the lord, by right of birth, of certain lands that bear your name, which suffered sequestration during the reign of the late Constanzo, tyrant of Pesaro, whose son, Giovanni, upheld that confiscation. Am I right?" "Your Excellency is very well informed. The Lord of Pesaro did make me tardy restitution, so tardy indeed that the lands which he restored to me had already virtually passed from his possession." Cesare smiled. "In recompense for the service you have rendered me this day," said he, and my heart thrilled at the words and at the thought of the joy which I was about to bear to my old mother, "I reinvest you in your lands of Biancamonte for so long as you are content to recognize in me your overlord, and to be loyal, true, and faithful to my rule." I bowed, murmuring something of the joy I felt and the devotion I should entertain. "Then that is done with. You shall have the deed from my hand by morning. And now, Madonna, will you grant me some explanation of your conduct in leaving Pesaro in this man's company, instead of repairing to your brother's house, when you awakened from the effects of the potion Ramiro gave you? Or must I seek the explanation from Messer Biancamonte? Her eyes fell before the scrutiny of his, and when they were raised again it was to meet my glance. And if Cesare could not for himself read the message of those eyes, why then his penetration was by no means what the world accounted it. "My lord," I cried, "let me explain. I love Madonna Paola. It was love of her that led me to the church and kept me there that night. It was love of her and the overmastering passion of my grief at her so sudden death that led me in a madness to desire once more to look upon her face ere they delivered it to earth's keeping. Thus was it that I came to discover that she lived. Thus was it that I anticipated Ramiro dell'Orca. He came upon us almost before I had raised her from the coffin, yet love lent me strength and craft to delude him. We hid a while in the sacristy, and it was there, after Madonna had revived, that the pent-up passion of years burst the bond with which reason had bidden me restrain it. "By the host," cried Cesare, his brows drawn down in a frown, "you are a bold man to tell me this. And you, Madonna," he cried, turning suddenly to her, "what have you to say?" "Only, my lord, that I have suffered more, I think, in these past few days than has ever fallen to the lifetime share of another woman. I think, my lord, that I have suffered enough to have earned me a little peace and a little happiness for the remainder of my days. All my life have men plagued me with marriages that were hateful to me, and this has culminated in the brutal act of Ramiro dell'Orca. Do you not think that I have endured enough?" He stared at her for a moment. "Then you love this fellow," he gasped. "You, Madonna Paola Sforza de Santafiore, one of the noblest ladies in all Italy, confess to love this lordling of a few barren acres?" "I loved him, illustrious, when he was less, much less than that. I loved him when he was little better than the fool of the court of Pesaro, and not even the shame of the Motley that disgraced him could stay the impulse of my affections." He laughed curiously. "By my faith," said he, "I have gone through life complaining of the want of frankness in the men and women I have met, but you too seem to deal in it liberally enough to satisfy the most ardent seeker after truth. I would that Pontius Pilate could have known you." Then he grew sterner. "But what account of this evening's adventure am I to bear to my cousin Ignacio?" She hung her head in silence, whilst my own spirit trembled. Then suddenly I spoke. "My lord," said I, "if you take her back to Pesaro, you may keep the deed of Biancamonte, for unless Madonna Paola goes thither with me, your gift is a barren one, your reward of no account or value to me." "I would not have it so," said he, his head on one side, and his fingers toying with his auburn beard. "You saved my life, and you must be rewarded fittingly." "Then, illustrious, in payment for my preservation of your life, do you render happy mine, and we shall thus be quits." "My lord," cried Paola, putting forth her hands in supplication, "if you have ever loved, befriend us now." A shadow darkened his face for an instant, then it was gone, and his expression was as inscrutable as ever. Yet he took her hands in his and looked down into her eyes. "They say that I am hard, bloodthirsty, and unfeeling," he said in tones that were almost of complaint, "but I am not proof against so much appeal. Ignacio must find him a bride in Spain, and if he is wise and would taste the sweets of life, he will see to it that he finds him a willing one. As for you two, Cesare Borgia shall stand your friend. He owes you no less. I will be godfather to your nuptials. Thus shall the blame and consequences rest on me. Paola Sforza de Santafiore is dead, men think. We will leave them thinking it. Filippo must know the truth, but you can trust me to make your brother take a reasonable view of what has come to pass. After all, there may be a disparity in your ranks, but it is purely adventitious, for noble though you may be, Madonna Paola, you are wedding one who seems no less noble at heart, whatever the parts he may have played in life. He smiled inscrutably as he added, I have in mind that you once sought service with me, Messer Biancamonte, and if a martial life eludes you still, I'll make you lord of something better far than Biancamonte. I thanked him, and Madonna joined me in that expression of gratitude, an expression that fell very short of all that was in our hearts. But touching that offer of his that I should follow his fortunes, I begged him not to insist. The possession of Biancamonte has from my cradle been the goal of all my hopes. It is patrimony enough for me, and there, with Madonna Paola, I'll take a long farewell of ambition, which is but the seed of discontent. Why, as you will, he sighed, and then, before more could be said, there came from the adjoining room a piercing scream. Cesare raised his head, and his lips parted in the faintest vestige of a smile. They are exacting the truth from the governor of Cesena, said he. I think, Madonna, that we had better move a little farther off. Ramiro's voice makes indifferent music for a lady's ear. She was white as death at the horrid noise, and all the things of which it may have reminded her, and so we passed from the antechamber and sought the more distant places of the castle. Here let me pause. We were married on the morrow, which was Christmas Eve, and in this grey dawn of the Christmas morning we set out for Biancamonte with the escort which Cesare Borgia placed at our disposal. As we rode out from the citadel of Cesena, we saw the last of Ramiro dell'Orca. Beyond the gates, in the centre of the public square, a block stood planted in the snow. On the side nearer the castle there was a dark mass, over which a rich mantle had been thrown. It was of purple colour, and in the uncertain light it was not easy to tell where the cloak ended and the stain that embrued the snow began. On the other side of the block a decapitated head stood mounted on an upright pike, and the sightless eyes of Ramiro dell'Orca looked from his grinning face upon the town of Cesena, which he had so wantonly misruled. Madonna shuddered and turned her head aside as we rode past that dread emblem of the Borgia justice. To efface from her mind the memory of such a thing on such a day, I talked to her as we cantered out into the country of the life to come, of the mother that waited to welcome us, and of the glad tidings with which we were to rejoice her on that Christmas day. There is no moral to my story. I may not end with one of those graceful admonitions beloved of Messer Boccacci, to whom in my jester's days I owed so much. Not mine is it to say with him, "Wherefore, gentle ladies, or noble sirs, beware of this, avoid that other thing." Mine is a plain tale, written in the belief that some account of those old happenings that befell me may offer you some measure of entertainment, and written, too, in the support of certain truths, which my contemporaries have been shamefully inclined and simoniacally induced to suppress. Many chroniclers, set forth how the Lord Vitellozzo Vitelli and his associates were barbarously strangled by Cesare's orders at Sinigaglia, and wilfully, for I cannot believe that it results from ignorance. Are they silent touching the reason, leaving you to imagine that it was done in obedience to a ruthlessness of character beyond parallel, so that you may come to consider Cesare Borgia as black as they were paid to paint him? To confute them do I set down these facts of which my knowledge cannot be called in question, and also that you may know the true story of Paola De Santafiore, and more particularly that part of it which lies beyond the death she did not die. The sun of that Christmas day was setting as we drew near to Biancamonte and the humble dwelling of my old mother. We fell into talk of her once more. Suddenly Paola turned in her saddle to confront me. "Tell me, Lord of Biancamonte, will she love me a little, think you?" she asked, to plague me. "Who would not love you, Lady of Biancamonte?" counter-questioned I. End of chapter 21, read by Amy of New Zealand, May 2025. End of The Shame of Motley by Rafael Sabatini.